I was regarded at Harvard Business School as being a communist.
This one is a bit of a mystery still, when my first tweet is going to happen.
Ken is fun, and Ken is a great friend to Barbie.
I call it catching the F train.
I was this fat unit, you know what I mean, in a suit, and it was clear that I was not the same as the others.
Hello again, everybody. Welcome to the February Better Marketing Podcast. Fantastic start to the year talking about creativity, and from one legend of the industry to another. And what we're going to talk about now is another favourite subject of mine, media, with David Porter, currently stepping down from being VP of Media for Unilever after a very storied career in the media industry. David, welcome.
Thank you very much for having me.
I know you're joining us from Singapore, David, but I also know that you've got an extraordinary track record of being out and about walking. I think you've done 500 straight days now of more than 15,000 steps. So where have you been? What have you been? How have you done that?
It's somewhere around that number. And anyone who knows me from my days in the UK knows that's not typical behaviour for me. But I guess, like some other people, I went through a few phases in the pandemic of trying to deal with it. And I think I described the first phase as therapy, which was kind of puzzles, jigsaw puzzles and making scale models. And then the second stage was trying to get back a rhythm. So I was doing virtual visits to all of our markets, but I was too close to the fridge and I was sat down for like 8 hours a day. So the third phase was to get back to life and get moving. So just so we're blessed here in terms of the environment, great weather, beautiful botanic gardens. So I get out on a daily basis, and I've been doing it for over a year now, and much better for it. So I've had a good pandemic. As mildly introverted and doing that, I've come out of this in better physical and mental health than I went into it, I think. So
that's fantastic to hear. And let me take you back down memory lane. I mean, you announced your retirement back at the end of last year on LinkedIn, must be said, featuring a glorious photo with a rather magnificent hairdo. And I do hope the team will rustle that one up to show everybody. And as you were walking down memory lane, it reminded me of how astonishingly media has changed over that time. A big question to start with, where do you see media now compared to where you started out? What would you be saying to your 20-year-old self now?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think I'd recognise the industry I'm in, to be honest, David, nor would anybody else. And of course, agencies, they're very, very much a young person's industry. So I'm not sure how much of that muscle memory is left. But we used to joke about being called cattle thieves with calculators. We were very back office. I don't know if I'm allowed to read from the writings of someone else, but I wanted to quote you something from one of advertising's greats. So we've all read this, Overview in Advertising. Nice thick tome, been around for ages. It's regarded as one of the Bibles of how to do advertising. He's got a section on jobs in advertising, David. It's 14 pages. And in that section, he's got a piece on media, and I'll read it to you. It says, media, I've never worked in the media department of an agency, but observation of those who have been successful in this field leads me to think they need an analytical mind, the ability to communicate numerical data in non-numerical formats, stability under pressure, and a taste for negotiation with the owners of media. That's 14 pages on jobs in advertising and 54 words on media. Yeah. And I just think, that's then, and this is now. If you want to learn about marketing, you go straight to things like how brands grow, the attention economy. It's changed completely, and I've loved that especially recently, that the academic marketers of this world have really focused on us. And at the other end of the spectrum, we have whereas before we used to get great learned books about advertising, this is still learned, but it's slightly different, right? When the great Bob Hoffman, who you had on recently, is kind of ripping the industry a new one, they're very, very different attitudes. And I feel blessed to have been through that process. And I think I came into it when it was still very much backroom. And really we were tolerated because we earned a commission on the buys we made, but it wasn't for people from good schools to go into, shall we say. And then we saw a few reformers. I think probably the one that I remember most, apart from my own boss, who was a gentleman by the name of Les Hewitt at Yellowhammer was Ken New, who was down at Abbott Mead in those days, and later went on to become part of PhD, of course. And they were really trying to professionalize the business and think about context and where we put the advertising, and really led the way for the PhDs and the Nakeds of this world. So huge change. And I've been really blessed to be able to work with some people who came into the business as kids and are now great leaders. So it delights me when I don't take responsibility for their careers, but when I see people like John Scorer, who now runs Mobster, which is a UK mobile proximity marketing outfit. Tim Irwin, of course, just made global COO of Essence. Mark Wheldon, who's a PhD, I think he's the chief strategy officer now. Francis Ralston Good runs Mediacom's global clients. These are great people, and it's been my pleasure to see them come through from an industry that really didn't exist back then. So I feel very satisfied with that part of it, and I've always worked on the basis that agencies are quite a revolving door, right, in terms of being traditionally a bit of a hire and fire mentality. So I've always kept a running count, and so long as I'd created more jobs than I'd taken away, I could justify that to myself. So, and I'm well up on that these days, so I'm feeling good about that.
One thing we share in common is we worked both sides of the fence, agency and client, and obviously, as you became VP of Media at Unilever, you were joining an organisation that was globally renowned for its focus on great media and doing things well. Can you tease out the kind of key differences and how you found the transition into being a client?
Yeah, and there are differences, and I think there's a difference, because I think agencies, first and foremost, even if they have a global reach, tend to be quite federal operations. They're local agencies with a big name badge on the door, and that's beginning to change. But it's slightly different from walking into a large corporate, as I'm sure you found, especially in the sector you're in terms of banking. I think the first thing, I don't think I could have done it as a 17, 18-year-old when I started in the industry. I couldn't have taken the kind of the hierarchical nature of the industry. The best advice I got when I came across was from someone who had been my client, who was then bringing me into the Unilever business, which was to think in terms of empathy without sympathy when dealing with the agency colleagues, who had been friends and colleagues in the past. So I understand your pain, I feel your pain, now we need to get this job done. It was very much kind of my introduction to agency management. So that was a huge change, and I think the thing I'm most grateful for was I felt that my clients, when I was in the agency world, were talking a language I didn't have. So I went back to school with a little bit of help from Stephen Allen down at what was then the media business. I went back to the Open University and finished the education that I had misused as a teenager, and picked up some business studies. And strangely, that became a ticket to the rest of the world, because I didn't have a degree. Suddenly I had a postgrad qualification, and that buys you work permits on most of the planet. So that's been a huge benefit. And of course, I had the chance before I became client side to work with the same clients agency side. So that really makes a big difference. So I shadowed the person I replaced agency side for many, many years across most of Asia Pacific, Africa, and other markets. So that's been a great journey. And in terms of what it's taken me to China, Dubai, Thailand, twice to Singapore. So my kids have had experience of being in, a Muslim market, Buddhist market, Christian, and also atheist. So they've seen that full gamut, and that's been a great education for them too.
How many times have you moved?
I think this move next will be proper house move number 17 or 18. So it's not as horrific as it is for some, but you do get used to knowing what a 40-foot container looks like in terms of the stuff that's around you. So you end up with a very strict one in, one out policy. And of course, the experience in every one of those markets is so different. So my first one, we bought Thailand blind, if you like, from Mindshare when they were looking for a Unilever lead there. And fortunately, I've got a very adventurous wife, and we just turned up with a book called Thailand Culture Shock and not a lot else. And my very first day, I met my team. I felt a hand in the small of my back as my chief exec whispered in my ear, "They're your team now. Keep it short, keep it funny," and threw me into the middle of this room. And it's probably the most interesting place I've ever worked in terms of the cultural difference in how people communicate. Thailand is full of ninjas when it comes to body language. It's on an entirely different level to what we're used to. And I found that super interesting. And I think perhaps the big lesson there was this word "sanuk." I don't know if that's a commonly known word in the West, but in Thai it means fun, and it also means work. So it goes back to agricultural days, sharing the harvest together. So the whole way of working in teams is, in my experience, utterly different to what I was used to in the West, and that became the thing that became the real stimulation for the sort of work that we were doing. It was just something I've never experienced before. Took to that and then realized that every country was going to be a new experience like that, and trying to find new rules of the road each time I moved. So I'm trying to think. The most extreme was probably recently, not long ago. I was based in Shanghai and I was working with Japan as well. So I was often commuting between the two. And I'm sure to a lot of Western eyes, those feel like quite similar markets, but they are diametrically opposed in terms of how people communicate. And so it was a real strain trying to adjust every time I moved from country A to country B, but a lot of fun.
And in terms of media, can we dip into a couple of things? I mean, I know, we'd have grown up in the multinational world of the speed of New York, a New York minute, but in Shanghai, I believe it's a Shanghai second.
That's very much the phrase I like to use, and I used to use a lot with visitors to China to kind of probably put the fear on them, because things certainly, when I was there, were moving at an incredible pace. And you probably remember there was that time when there was a rumor that half of the world's construction cranes were in the big Chinese cities because everything was taking off. And it was amazing to live through that time and to realize just what degree of change and stress the human being, the human brain and body can take. And we saw it in that generation, those one-child family kids who came through, through a digital revolution, like something we'd never seen before. And in fact, I think the changes that those guys went through are quite similar to what a lot of young people in the West are experiencing now through lockdowns, through learning online at home, and through having friendships that are largely digital. So in that time, we were seeing hundreds of thousands of digital natives, springing up in China and playing by completely different rules. So that journey, I guess, for me, in terms of coping with change, probably started back in Thailand, working through my first coup, then into the Middle East, where we had the Arab Spring, which was very connected to the digital world and to the emerging social media, and then on into China, where everything changed in 3 or 4 years. So, David, we went from spending something like 10-15% of our budgets online to over 60% in 4 years. And my chairman at the time had a very compelling presentation, which I'm dying to get hold of if I can find it, which basically proved mathematically that China was going through a pace of change that was something like 10,000 times faster than the Industrial Revolution in Britain.
Wow.
So just a phenomenal shift in how we do business. And it's been, seriously, I mean, if anyone hasn't worked in China, I would definitely recommend it to them. That old phrase they used to use in London about, was it failed in London, try Hong Kong? And the acronym, boy, those times are long, long gone. And I think 3 or 4 years in China should be everybody's goal if they want to work in one of the large corporates these days.
And obviously there's a plethora of new digital offerings. And, I once said, don't be the dog that barks at every passing car, because marketeers love the shiny new. How have you managed to kind of keep people's feet on the ground and not get diverted from doing the right thing to just doing the new thing?
It's a fair point. But there are two sides to this. I think there's a lot of evidence now that when things are in their absolute infancy digitally, they are highly appealing to a small group of people and can have a massive impact. I mean, I remember when WeChat in China started started monetizing its messaging service. It was very restricted. They were careful to only have 15 or 20 brands on, in the entire network. They were selective about who got to see what message, and they caused quite a stir in the community because there was such a new thing. So that was a great opportunity, but that only lasted a few weeks. And once you're over that first honeymoon, you start to get into all the brand safety issues and all the worries about how safe these things are, because of course nobody loves new media more than bad actors, and they're always in there early. And I think that's something that the WFA has recognized a lot. So I think there's a lot of merit in being kind of a first mover, but then there's a need, I think, in a lot of cases to pause and make sure that the infrastructure's there and that the bad actors aren't, taking over the channel and so forth. So we've been pretty across this, both through the WFA and in our own right, to make sure that we're as brand safe as we can be. I don't know how you feel about this, David, but I think it's pretty tough for us to actually make the internet a totally safe and clean place. But there's a great deal we can do to try and keep our brands away from the bad parts of it, and to try and really make sure it's safe for us, safe for our customers, and more effective.
Can you wind back the clock and remember when you joined and what you've seen change meanwhile, and what you think the unfurling role of the WFA is?
Sure. Well, I think I started in China because we were setting up a media forum there. I think it was probably just being instigated when I got there, and that was a great opportunity because we had this exploding digital world and nobody kind of quite knew how to navigate it. So that was a chance for brands of all sizes to swap notes and to start to learn what was going on. And of course, we couldn't transfer any knowledge from the rest of the world because it was this completely unique ecosystem, which caught up and overtook the West in 2 or 3 years flat. So it was changing so quickly that we really needed to sit together as brands to make sure we understood it. And on the back of that, suddenly e-commerce exploded for a number of reasons, but it became the primary sales channel for quite a lot of categories. So that was the early work. I think when I came across to Singapore 4 or 5 years ago, then things started to move forward in terms of brand safety. And I think the digital charter was probably one of our finest moments in terms of the impact it's had and the simplicity of it, the fact that everyone could sign up to it. I think that made a huge difference. I'm a big fan of the work on the Unstereotype Alliance, although I take no credit for it. I'm very happy to promote it on every platform I get. And I've loved the way that we at the WFA have evolved it, but also the way Unilever has taken that and really pushed to go from just having the right look in front of the camera to thinking about the people behind the camera, the people in the agency, the people in our entire media and marketing supply chain, and making sure we've got a great approach to diversity across everything we do. And of course, that diversity is defined and works differently as you move across the planet. But I really think we've made great progress there. The meetings I've really enjoyed actually have been quite crunchy media meetings where we've got a variety of brands of all size, all categories in one room. And you bring in an expert who's talking about something like invalid traffic, which is basically ad fraud. And seeing the scales fall from a lot of those marketers' eyes, realizing A, this happens, and B, they're allowed to challenge people about it, and they're allowed to ask their agency questions about it. Because that kind of right to challenge, I think, sits kind of automatically with only a handful of large advertisers. And through the WFA, we've managed to socialize that a bit more, so people really do push back on these things. So now I think we've got much more of a consensus in the industry about what we need to do across that whole digital supply chain. And of course, GARM is the latest incarnation of that. And I think, as far as I recall, someone else may know better, I think it's the first time that there's ever been a press release with the 3 big digital platforms all signing the same message, which is in and of itself a great step forward. And I know people are impatient for change, but all change is good if it's moving things forward. And however small those steps are, it's terrific that we're starting to set some standards and to get things going.
And what about the arrival of the metaverse and your view of that? And obviously, we've seen Facebook change their name to Meta. We could huge tangent available to talk about that, but we won't take it. But given the Shanghai second, are you seeing that as a reality for consumers and for brands?
Do you know, I don't know. And I don't mind saying I don't know. I mean, we all remember Second Life. And one of the London agencies, I think it might have been BBH, Bartle Bogle Hegarty at the time, started running their town halls on Second Life. You know, it was terribly, terribly precious. And I'm really not 100% there yet. I remember when I first started to see, you know, Oculus Drift and the whole kind of the whole immersive experience, I realized that there were a large number of people who either got motion sickness from these things, and I know that's getting better, but I'm part of that gang, or wouldn't put the headsets on because of their haircut. So I think, you know, there's and yeah, that's the truth. So I think there's a couple of things that we need to resolve there. I think firstly, you know, having technology that is truly accessible and universally popular. It sounds basic, but I think we're still not there. But also, my hope for the metaverse would be that it's distributed evenly and widely, and that there's a degree of open source about it. You know, all that optimism that we had when the internet first landed in our laps, I think this is a chance to rebuild that. And I do, you know, I wish everybody that's playing in that space every success, but I do hope that we have something that's a bit more democratic and evenly distributed and available to all. So my guess about who's going to win is that the winners are still at college. They haven't dropped out yet, as they inevitably will before they found their companies. And I'm just fascinated to see when those young people start winning in this space, what's their motivation? Are they going to want world domination? Are they going to want to go to IPO and sell out to one of the big guys? Or will they really try and build something that's new?
Listen, I think that what a wonderful thought that is, that it should be evenly distributed and more democratic. I think that'd be great because, you know, much of the digital revolution has not been. I mean, back to Second Life for a minute. That was in my Vodafone days. I think we were one of the first brands on it, and we had a retail store. And that's where I learned it's good to be a slow follower, sometimes even a fast follower. But obviously, you know, you want to learn and experiment, and it was Google that taught us all to put 10% of our time and 10% of our money on trying things and learning from them. But there's so much to try now. David, you've worked across many a market, and many global marketeers make the mistake of thinking they can do it from one place and they don't really experience the differences. I mean, what kind of regional, local differences have you seen that have made a real difference to the day job?
Wow, don't know where to start with that, David. I mean, it's just so total. You know, I don't think many Europeans think of Europe as a single market, and I don't. That's not a political statement. I mean, in terms of when we're marketing, we're very nuanced about how we go about things, you know, across that continent. And for some reason, we fail to do the same thing when we work across Africa, South Asia, China. You know, these are huge, huge markets. Some of them countries with multiple traditions, histories, cuisines, religions, and somehow one size is supposed to fit all. So I've learned a great deal. And I mean, I think particularly eye-opening for me was the way that in mainland China and in India, the first question we ask when we're setting up a campaign is geographical. You know, which 19 or 20 of the 100 markets are we going to promote ourselves in, and you know, where we have the right route to market. And that kind of granularity is so important. And we're also seeing, probably more in India than in South Asia, probably more so than in North Asia, a trend towards vernacularization, is that a word, of the materials. So local, not just local language, of which there are a plethora in India, for example, but also local culture in terms of, you know, the visual appeal, how, you know, how sets are dressed, how the characters perform, and really starting to change it up so that we're seeing national or global brands in India that look and feel like they're local. And it makes a difference. We see the results. So that's been very valuable. I think the challenge now for a lot of global brands, of course, is how do I do that without breaking the bank? Because I do feel a pang of pain for a lot of marketers these days, because there's so much more on their plate, right? They've got the same kind of brand budget as they had 5 years ago, but they're expected to do something on purpose or CSR or sustainability or whatever their thing is. They're supposed to build the brand, and they're also supposed to be trying to do performance in terms of direct response or sales online out of the same money. And they're having, as individuals, to see the job all the way through to the door of the store, but now also all the way to the cash register. So it does add a pressure on. But with that also comes a responsibility to do our best to communicate in ways that resonate in each of the individual markets. And culturally, they are so different that we really need to think that through very, very carefully. But of course, the really, truly great brands can find a tone of voice and a kind of a brand essence that works across everything. But that's rarer than hen's teeth, I would say.
It is, but I also think we had probably about this time last year, Connie Brahms was talking with us and talking about the content engines that you've built at Unilever to enable that localization, and the in-house studios, I think, have been a great part of that, as indeed has the AI that's allowed effective content to be pulled out. So the whole ecosystem digitally is really impacting this. Have you seen that work well?
Yeah, I mean, I forget the number. I can't remember how many thousands of pieces of content we made for the last Singles Day, 11/11 in China, but it's somewhere between 5 and 10,000, just to give you a scale. And something that's been interesting for me as we've evolved at Unilever is that as we've built our digital hubs where we do all our data-driven marketing in Asia, and as we've added into that things like U Studio, which is the content engine, increasingly they come under the sponsorship or the leadership of our media directors in the markets. So you've now, just thinking back to where we started this conversation with media in the back room, and now the same discipline is orchestrating a lot of the content, a lot of the advertising assets, how we go to market, how we then take that through into performance and e-commerce. And boy, what a change. And yeah. I know I'm very old, not that long. It's one generation of marketer for whom it's changed. So it really has been dramatic. And I do think it's different East and West in the sense that if you just look at Amazon versus Lazada or Shopee or any of the Chinese or Chinese-owned e-commerce platforms, you see the difference. It's, with things like Amazon, it's very much a digitized version of a department store. Everything's in its place. You search, you find, you buy, you leave. It's a very orderly, kind of masculine way of shopping, I would argue. In China, of course, the e-commerce platforms initially they feel like they're slightly more chaotic. You're tending not to go in and find what you're looking for, but to be jumped on by somebody else who's going to sell you something you didn't even know you needed. And it's much more of an interactive experience, much more like a shopping mall or even a market. And people are spending time there for pleasure and for leisure and just browsing. And very much like with the shopping mall where you'll have the food court and the cinema, so you have the equivalents on these channels. So they're becoming places, I think, where people will spend a lot of time and be entertained. So their roles in our whole marketing mix are going to be quite different as well. And it'd be interesting to see what happens with China in the next few years, because until recently it was quite aggressively outward bound in terms of its e-commerce and the rest of its digital offering. And of course, with the latest 5-year plan, they've reined themselves in a bit, perhaps trying to encourage talent to move from this kind of soft internet into the hard internet of infrastructure and microprocessors and all this other stuff. So it remains to be seen how quickly that will roll out. But I do think it's going to give the Western way of doing things a real run for its money in the next decade.
And as you reflect back on your storied career, and I'm sure you've been doing that, because I remember it fondly when I stepped out. What do you really take note of? What do you remember? What do you think looking back? And obviously, I'm going to come to the the looking forward bit next. But looking back,
I think the biggest thing was just the excitement of being part of something and helping to change it and to professionalize it. There's not many opportunities to do that, I think, in many careers, because they just those opportunities don't write themselves. They're kind of happy accidents. So I think the thrill of having been part of that change and to still be part of this, it will never leave me. And funnily enough, I was in touch just this week with my second ever boss who hired me when I was just 18. And he's just sent me today like a 20-page email because he doesn't do social media. And it's just been a great reminder of how we moved that needle and how we started to bring in just basic ideas, right? Like the idea that your wonderful piece of advertising, your commercial, wasn't a piece of advertising until we put it somewhere where it would have an effect, where somebody would see it. And I think we fast forward 40 years and we're still having that conversation about things like the attention economy and making sure that we're reaching human beings instead of bots. But we couldn't be doing that now if we hadn't made those early changes back in the day. One thing I do miss, I have to say, is the concept of full service agencies. I think the split between media and creative was completely avoidable and entirely down to how a few media people were treated in the agencies in which they worked. And it's a great shame. And I think it's taken a long time to start to bring us all back full circle to the point where those slights have been largely forgotten and people are beginning to really work together. But we shouldn't forget the lesson.
yeah, I mean, I think that's had an impact on how clients behave, how agents behave. Interesting, because we're both from the full service world. I ran an agency that had a splendid media department in it, and it's interesting to watch the travel back and indeed to speak to young'uns in the industry because they have no concept of that, which is a real shame because what a client needs is joined up thinking. And I know it's a cliche to say you got it from one place, but I do think that's a thing that the industry is striving to put back together again.
Agree, and funnily enough, we had a really good experiment with this in Singapore recently. We've just relocated offices, so we haven't been able to recreate this yet. But in our previous building, pre-COVID, we had a floor which was basically, it was called level 3 because it was the third floor, snappy. But we populated it with startups, so it basically became an incubator, a workspace for startups. And then gradually into that, we seeded a team from Mindshare who worked on our business. And then on top of that, that went from 12 media people to 60 WPP people who also were involved with us. So we effectively had, literally on the floor below us, a full service agency in this startup environment, which is very stimulating in itself. And yeah, I mean, a few people was a bit nervous when they realized their clients were just going to wander down and have a coffee with them unannounced. But I think anyone that was involved in that will say it was a really successful experiment, and I hope we'll see more of that because there's no reason for these individual pieces of the supply chain to be so isolated from each other.
And what about media ownership and the change we've seen there, especially seen through your now Asian eyes? How do you see that impacting the future?
It has changed beyond recognition. I think we've got a few incredibly large, incredibly powerful partners that we do business with now. I think for a while, frankly, especially in the West, they kind of took the talking stick away from agencies in terms of understanding how to do advertising on their channels. I think that's getting a bit more balanced now, but they're always going to have a powerful voice because each one of them is so unique. That understanding how the public uses that channel and how we can get as native and relevant as possible with our communications is a big part of how we do business with them. So, and this is something when I'm working with startups or with anybody who's in that space, in their early days, I'm really encouraging them to try and build a body of advice about how brands should work with them because I think it's such an important part of it. yeah, I think that when we talked about the metaverse, I think it's very interesting to think about how that may change things. Um, I think the focus at the moment, certainly in Asia, has been over the last 4 or 5 years in working carefully with the traditional media who tend not to be omni-channel. If I can steal the retail word, they tend to be in traditional media specifically. Trying to work with them to bring them into the digital world via a soft landing. And I think a lot of them have taken a lot of advice from the big agency groups and from big brands about how they make that transition, because they can't stand still forever. And I think that has been one of the biggest challenges in Asia. But we're making good progress now. And yeah, I think it's been interesting watching agencies perhaps learn to coexist with their clients in the same room when they're talking to the media in a way that wasn't the case before. But that's unavoidable because we do so much more with those partners than just buy media. I mean, if I think about our Google relationship, for example, where we can use Google Earth and traffic APIs to predict the most efficient delivery route in rural India, or we can use similar data to predict where economic activity is springing up in villages, so maybe we should focus on those. Or we can use satellite photography to keep our agricultural partners true to their word in terms of deforestation. These are not applications that your average media buyer is going to be using on a daily basis, right? But they're still very much part of these relationships. And I don't think that will slow down.
And obviously scale businesses can benefit from those kind of relationships, but I do think, critic though I've been of the platforms, the role they've had with SMEs and small businesses, especially through the pandemic, has been laudable. I mean, they've kept a lot of businesses going that otherwise might have gone under. How about the startup economy and their partnerships with the platforms? Is that working well? Because I can see why scale gets the attention it gets. So no wonder Unilever works so well. But how about the small startup?
Yes, good question, David. And especially in China, I spent a lot of time with VCs and other people involved in the startup economy, because what became clear there was the average individual VC in China was seeing and doing due diligence on more startups than the whole of the Bay Area was doing in the States. The scale was immense. And just through the kind of meta-analysis of what they were looking at, you could get a very good idea of what was coming on the horizon next. So things like home delivery of food. It was very apparent in my early days in Shanghai that this was going to be massive in China because these guys were vetting 50 or 60 organizations that were doing it. So I've always found talking to VCs and talking to the startup economy as a vital part of your futurology in terms of planning what's coming next. And I think the reality in China is probably still the case that if you're going to be a successful startup in the digital world, you need a big brother. So you're probably going to get aligned with one of the big players. But then along comes a ByteDance and home of TikTok and completely challenges that and turns it on its head. So there are still exceptions. And there's a vibrant startup economy I see in pretty much the whole of the region now. I think India is suddenly getting there in terms of playing a little bit of catch up, but has now gone from being one of the later developers for its size to being a really kind of strong adolescent, if you like. But across the board, if you look in Indonesia, Vietnam, Thailand, Philippines, there's a lot going on. And things happen at a different pace in Asia, sometimes accidentally. So, for instance, when the government took away the TV license of Philippines' largest TV network, they just went online. And accidentally, the Philippines government became the digital transformation officer for the country. Unintended consequences, right? Literally 24 hours. And this is something I've loved in Asia is, with the exception of a couple of markets, I don't live in the land of flat graphs, right? I mean, everything that I work on, the graphs go up, absolutely insane. And that's very challenging, but it's also very exciting. And with all that change, there's always opportunity.
That's fantastic. And David, what next? What are you planning next?
Oh, So next up, plan A was very simple. Get my Canadian permanent residence. My wife and kids are Anglo-Canadian, so I got lots of points in the bank on that. Get to BC and get up a mountain and enjoy, after 45 years of media and marketing, enjoy a bit of a breather. It's been thrown slightly into confusion by phone calls I've been getting from people who are keen for me to do some advisory work. So I'm trying to be very selective and very limited about that, and to do things where, I'm working with people I like, on things I care about, that I can do, in a couple of hours every 2 or 3 weeks, so that it doesn't become a full-time job, because that's not the intention. And I've been really focusing on things where either it's making a difference in the last yard in terms of doing things on mobile that will help at the sales end. So I'm working with an Indonesian startup there called Grivi, who are really focused on driving brick and mortar sales from mobile and collecting first party data from happy shoppers. Yeah. And there's a couple of holy grails in there for a lot of marketers. So it's a small new thing, but I'm very excited by it. And then I've got the absolute privilege of working with Karen Nelson-Field and her Amplified Intelligence team on her mission, which I think actually Unilever's partly guilty for starting her on this journey a few years ago when we commissioned some work from her back in the Ehrenberg Bass kind of era. Which is, her mission is really just to get brands back in front of human beings who are looking at their communications and who are paying attention, which seems like quite a good motive, quite a good goal. So those will be going on, but I do want to get to Canada and I want to enjoy those mountains, and maybe 1 or 2 more along the way, but we'll see.
Well, fantastic. Listen, you will be upping the step counter. And again, on behalf of all of us, thank you so much for all the time and effort you've put in to the WFA. You've helped many learn many things and make media better as all part of our better marketing program. So last thing, what should any CMO have at the top of their list at the moment? What should they be focusing on?
Do you know what? I mean, I knew you were going to ask me this, and I've been struggling to try and get it down to one thing, but I think it's this truth that we all know, and it's always the elephant in the room, but we brought it back in the Unilever work that we're doing now under Eleni Santos with her movement to get on the front line. And part of that is to keep it real. And by that, I'm talking about the truth that for a lot of brand categories, the public really doesn't care as much as we'd like them to. And they're hankering for our next commercial. And this thing we talked about earlier, that as a consequence of that, brands have such high expectations about the value exchange they can get away with and the level of engagement they're going to get. And I think that leaves us 2 things to fix for a lot of brands. One is what we talked about in terms of strategic, thought through value exchanges that mean something to the public. And the other is what I hope to be doing with Karen and her team, which is to redouble the efforts to put great assets in front of real people who are actually watching. So in the interest of keeping it simple, I'd probably list those 2 things. By the way, David, I think WFA is brilliantly positioned to help on both of those. And I am hoping that I can continue to be as engaged as possible with the great work that WFA has been doing, just as you have, of course. Yeah. So I hope to be seeing you and a lot of the WFA team again soon.
Yeah, likewise. So listen, absolute delight to talk to you. Thank you so much for your time. And to everybody else, it looks like we've almost got a plan here, because when we're back in March, we will indeed be talking to Karen, and we'll be looking at measurement and how great creativity, great content, great context all come together when you measure it properly. So have a great February and look forward to seeing you soon. And again, David, thank you so much. Absolute privilege. Bye.
Thank you for having me.